none of those shops left.
Opposite the Laurels, an interesting modern house, Southside, started life as a sectional building, with panels held together with bolts between two roof-supporting end walls. It was a demonstration house for prospective customers. In the intervening years, the entire outside has been replaced with more permanent brick walls and extensions. Most of the older, more substantial houses in the village were named after trees, and many still keep their arboreal titles. But the house which was formerly called the Yews is now named Village House. Behind it stood 3 cottages, now removed, which were all jammed together. Miss Rayner had a cat on a string and lived there with her mother. The houses were approached from behind the chapel.
One of the cottages had a chimney pot showing a face with its tongue protruding, and this pot is now in a nearby garden. It's said that the face was meant as an insult to the landlord. A similar chimney adorned the old cottage behind the Leather Bottle Inn, with the same intention. All these cottages were owned by Henry Smith until 1928. At one time, a potter used to work from a cottage behind the old smithy on the green. Could he have made these customized chimneys?
The present Wesleyan Methodist Chapel opened in 1904, although Methodism had been active in earlier buildings since the 18th century. Thomas Innocent seems to have made the first moves towards establishing Methodism in Cropwell in 1773, and services were held in his house. Then in 1827 they built a chapel, now the schoolroom at the rear of the present chapel, to accommodate the growing congregation. The whole cost of building the present chapel, raising which was a major effort at the time, was less than £900. In 1899, the arrival of a famous evangelist, Gypsy Smith, was met by 3,000 people who gathered in a tent in John Newton's field opposite the chapel to hear him. Gypsy Smith made another visit to the village in 1905, when a total of over £77 was collected, several years of income for the average worker.
The bungalow next to the chapel, Sunnycroft, was built by Mr. Newton, who rented the paddock opposite, now bungalows. Always wearing a black eye patch, he kept chickens and pigs, and also farmed the Fern Farm at Cropwell Bishop. On the south side, on the site of Little Acre, was a coal yard run by Mr. Hemingway. Villagers obtained much of their coal from this yard, and another in the centre of the village.
Next to Sunnycroft stood a very small cottage built right against the pavement, and in the 50s this was occupied by the Russells, who were a family with 6 children, living in a house of 1 up and 1 down. Later, when the old forge became vacant, they moved there.
Beside the old forge, end on to the road, was Mrs. Kemp's cottage. This was the last old thatched cottage in the village. The present-day thatchings on the green are recent. Pictures of it show a corrugated asbestos roof prior to its demolition in the 60s, when it was found to have been timber framed. The most well-known view of the village must be that of the old forge. Postcards showing the blacksmith at work on the corner outside the smithy make clear the relative peace and quiet of the road as the old car potters along the street. Another view reveals the door on Main Street, behind which was the bicycle shop, housed in what is now a living room. Petrol, oils, spares, repairs, agent for Campion cycles, and, according to his billheads, the blacksmith Ernest Cotton was the village motor mechanic. It was in such a shop that carbide was bought for the lamps. For a time, 2 families of the brothers Widowson were accommodated in this small house. The cottage was among those condemned as unfit for habitation in the 1960s, when it was occupied by Mr. and Mrs. Ferreira. Outside, a cistern collected rainwater which was obtained by the pump.
Main Street, earlier called Town Street, begins at the old police house, older that is than the old police house on Radcliffe Road. Now called Corner House, this was once 2 small cottages and later became a bakery. A bread oven was found at the back during renovations about 10 years ago. the late Victorian era, it was made into a police house and was probably the home of the village policeman Abraham Bosworth. Although it was owned by Henry Smith, as were many of the villagers' houses, the county police rented it for a few pounds a year. When the Henry Smith estate was sold in 1924, the annual rent income was £7.10. Shortly after this sale, the police house in Radcliffe Road was built.
Because Mrs. White lived there, it is still called Whitey's by older residents.
Sheldane is the successor to 3 cottages, 2 wash houses and 2 privies and the joint use of a well. Early in the century it was called Squire's Row, but was later bought by Sheldons of the Rookery and became known as Sheldon's Cottages. A well-remembered resident lived here, May Harrison, who owned the field at the corner of Back Lane and Tythby Road, which is still called May's Field. May's well-known figure with her beret was a sight that older residents recall with affection and amusement.
The large house next door is Pear Tree Cottage. Until the First World War, it was a thriving shop owned by Isaac Saxton, selling grocery and other produce. Customers entered through a door in the wall fronting the posts, the outline of which can still be seen. In the yard at the top of the present drive were stores for the goods, and from a promotional calendar for 1902 it can be seen that it was run as a go-ahead village store. Mr. Saxton was crippled and was helped for several years by Fred Marriott, who, after the demise of Mr. Saxton, transferred to the opposite side of Main Street and opened a well-run and popular grocery store in Butler's Oak. Mr. Saxton owned the cottages behind his shop, and to this day they are known as Saxton's Row. These comprised 4 terraced cottages with 1 bedroom, a landing and a living room, with outside privies and a communal wash house. Such facilities were the usual features of these cottages, which often housed families with children in very cramped conditions. In the 1960s, the row came into the ownership of an elderly lady in her 80s, Mrs. Crooks, who modernised them by adding an inside lavatory, bathroom and lean-to kitchen on the ground floor of each, and installing her mother, Mrs. Sarah Hoff, in cottage number 1, where she lived to the age of 107, dying in 1981 after receiving many telegrams of congratulation from the Queen and Nottingham dignitaries and media attention for her long life.
On the other side of the posts, a saddlery was run by Mr. Frank Knowles, who lived in the house now known as Ivy Cottage. His workshop was a shed close to the pathway. Opposite Pear Tree Cottage, 2 small cottages formerly called numbers 1 and 2 West Lee cottages once were used to house servants who were employed at West Lee, the large house near the green.
There was originally a 3rd cottage, now incorporated into Honeysuckle Cottage. It was a 1-room dwelling. Evidence of the original reed and plaster floor is still clearly visible inside. Next door, what is now a rather gracious property called Butler's Oak, began life as a pub, the Royal Oak. In 1868, having been bought by Henry Smith, it closed as soon as the tenant's lease ran out and was turned into 2 dwellings. At the front, Mr. and Mrs. Marriott set up their shop, the window facing the street being the display window. The shop survived until the 30s, after which it was used as a private house. Originally 2 cottages, they are now combined into 1.
In my school days, I can remember particular the little sweet shops. One was Mrs. Wisher during the First War, when sweets was rationed. She could sometimes get sweets. Her little house was where at one time the Royal Oak pub, that was at the top of the street. When if we got a penny or 2 to spare, we used to say, "Oh, you went to Mrs. Wisher's for some blackjack," and she was always very obliging. She'd wrap it up, and when Mr. Saxton packed up, Fred Marriott took the end bought the house where Mrs. Wisher was and the other end of the house, and eventually it was made into